You wake up tired. Tired in a way that feels harder to explain. You slept. You stayed in bed long enough. You have not run a marathon. And you have not spent 12 hours doing difficult labor. In fact, some days you barely do anything at all, and yet the exhaustion remains. It follows you into the morning. It sits beside you through the afternoon. And by evening, you feel as though the day has taken something from you despite having little to show for it. You then ask a friend or acquaintance, "Why am I so exhausted and drained all the time?" They say, "Maybe you've been working too hard. You probably need more rest." And sometimes that answer is true. But there is another kind of exhaustion that rest does not seem to solve. Like when you take a day off, but the exhaustion remains. Or when you sleep longer, and the exhaustion still remains. At some point, you begin asking, how can I be tired when I have barely done anything? The answer is that activity is not the only thing that consumes energy. There is visible work, and there is invisible work. Visible work is easy to recognize, like writing reports, studying for exams, building something, cleaning the house, or driving across town. These activities demand energy, and when they are finished, you understand why you feel tired. But invisible work is different. It leaves no obvious evidence, no completed task, no finished product, and no measurable achievement. Yet it can consume enormous amounts of psychological energy. Because while your body may appear to be resting, your mind may be doing something else entirely. It may be carrying things, like unfinished thoughts, uncertainty, decisions, conversations that never happened, futures that have not been decided, and emotions that have not been acknowledged. The human mind has a remarkable tendency to keep returning to anything that feels unresolved, an unanswered question, a difficult decision, a conflict with another person, or even a future that remains uncertain. The mind circles these things repeatedly, searching, rehearsing, predicting, preparing, revisiting. Not because it enjoys doing so, but because it wants closure. And until closure arrives, the process continues. Imagine trying to rest while holding a heavy suitcase. You could sit down, you could stop walking, you could close your eyes. But the weight would still be there. Many people are attempting to rest while mentally carrying dozens of suitcases at once. Questions about work, questions about money, questions about relationships, questions about purpose, questions about who they are becoming, questions about whether they are falling behind, and even questions about choices they have not yet made. Therefore, although the body remains still, the mind does not. And eventually, the mind begins charging interest on everything it carries. One unresolved issue becomes two become five, and five become 10. Soon, exhaustion no longer comes from life itself. It comes from constantly managing everything life might become. This is one reason anxiety feels so tiring. People often think anxiety is fear, but anxiety is also labor. The labor of continuously preparing for futures that have not arrived. The labor of imagining outcomes. The labor of monitoring threats. And the labor of trying to control uncertainty. That is why even when nothing happens, even when everything appears fine, the mind remains on duty. And a mind that never leaves work eventually becomes exhausted. But anxiety is not the only source of invisible work. There is another source that often goes unnoticed: emotional suppression. Many people spend years trying not to feel what they feel. Not because they are dishonest, but because they believe functioning requires not feeling. So disappointment gets pushed aside, grief gets postponed, anger gets buried, loneliness gets ignored, and even fear gets disguised as productivity. The problem is that these emotions do not disappear when ignored. They simply continue existing beneath awareness. And maintaining that separation requires energy. Think of holding a beach ball underwater. You can do it, but only while applying constant force. The moment you stop, it rises. Suppressed emotions operate in much the same way. The energy is not spent feeling them. The energy is spent holding them down. And over time, that effort becomes exhausting. This is why some people feel strangely lighter after crying. Nothing external has changed. No problem has been solved. Yet energy returns, because some of the work has stopped. The effort of containment has relaxed. Something that was being carried is finally allowed to move. There is also a deeper form of exhaustion that has become increasingly common: identity exhaustion. This occurs when different parts of you want different things. Part of you wants stability, part of you wants freedom, part of you wants peace, part of you wants achievement, part of you wants safety, and part of you wants adventure. None of these desires are wrong. The difficulty is that they often point in different directions, and when the mind cannot decide which version of life it wants, it begins negotiating endlessly, back and forth every day without reaching a conclusion. The mind keeps asking, should I stay or leave? Should I risk it or play it safe? Should I pursue what excites me or what protects me? Should I keep going or start over? These questions appear simple, but living inside them is not, because every possibility requires imagining a different future. And imagining futures is work, because it traps the mind in a cycle of simulations, running one scenario, then another, searching for certainty, searching for the perfect answer, and searching for a future that contains no loss. But such a future does not exist, because every choice closes other doors, and every path leaves something behind. So when the mind refuses to accept this reality, it remains stuck in permanent evaluation, which is exhausting. This is why some people feel more tired after a day of thinking than after a day of physical activity. The body recovers from effort, but the mind struggles to recover from endless uncertainty. At this point, many people try to solve the problem with more rest, another weekend, another day off, or even another evening spent doing nothing. But rest only works when mental work has stopped. And for many people, mental work has not stopped because their minds continue carrying unfinished emotional and psychological burdens. That is why genuine recovery remains difficult. So what do you do to recover from this exhaustion? The answer is surprisingly simple. You just need to stop asking how to gain more energy, and instead start asking what is consuming the energy you already have. Then look for the unfinished things, like the decision you keep postponing, the conversation you keep avoiding, the emotion you keep suppressing, the uncertainty you keep rehearsing, or even the question you keep carrying without ever addressing. You do not need to solve everything. You only need to stop carrying everything. Because one completed decision can create more relief than an entire weekend of rest. One honest conversation can free more energy than another hour of sleep. And one acknowledged emotion can reduce more tension than another attempt at distraction, because every resolved burden returns a small piece of attention back to you. And attention is where energy lives. This is why clarity often feels energizing, not because clarity creates energy, but because clarity stops wasting it. The same is true of acceptance. Sometimes the most exhausting thing is not reality itself. It is fighting reality. Fighting what happened, fighting what did not happen, fighting uncertainty, fighting limitations, and fighting change. Eventually, the struggle becomes heavier than the thing being resisted. But remember that acceptance does not mean liking something. It means stopping the endless expenditure of energy required to argue with what already exists. And once that argument ends, resources become available again. Not because life became easier, but because the internal battle became quieter. So if you feel tired despite doing very little, do not immediately assume that your problem is laziness, or weakness, or lack of motivation. Look deeper. Ask yourself what your mind has been carrying, what conversation has been repeating, what decision remains open, what emotion remains unfelt, or what conflict remains unresolved. Because sometimes the exhaustion you feel is not evidence that you have done too much. It is evidence that something inside you has been working for far too long without reaching completion. And until that hidden work is acknowledged, no amount of rest will fully restore you.